India. It's a nation that, well, it truly captures the global imagination, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The world's fifth largest economy, booming tech sector.
Right, and on a path to become this multi-trillion-dollar powerhouse. It's just an incredible story of growth, really.
It is, yeah. And yet what's striking is, despite that momentum, some economists point to this powerful, almost invisible handbrake.
A handbrake? You mean slowing things down?
Exactly. A structural impediment. Something that some suggest could be shaving off as much as 6% of India's GDP every single year.
6% annually.
Yeah.
That's monumental for an economy growing that fast.
It's huge.
And you're saying this isn't just, a social issue. It's a fundamental economic hindrance.
Precisely. And that's what our deep dive is focusing on today. The caste system. How upper caste dominance, how persistent casteism is actually impacting India's economic destiny.
And maybe just as importantly, how this whole reality is sort of obscured globally, like a blind spot for people looking at India.
That's a big part of it, yes. So our mission today really is to go beyond the headlines.
Okay.
We want to establish, using clear empirical data, the undeniable economic impact of this system.
Because understanding this isn't just academic, right?
Not at all. It's crucial for you, for anyone, to be truly well-informed on one of the most critical, yet often overlooked, issues facing such a globally important economy.
Okay, so to really get a grip on the economic cost, I guess we have to start with the basics. Wealth.
That's where the power lies, fundamentally. And the numbers here are, well, they're pretty staggering.
Wow, staggering.
Well, look at the 2024 report from the World Inequality Lab. It's quite revealing.
Okay.
It found that India's upper castes now, they make up less than a third of the population. Some estimates put it closer to 22%.
Right, a minority.
A relatively small segment, yeah. But they control nearly 55% of all national wealth.
Over half the wealth in the hands of less than a quarter of the people.
That's the kind of concentration we're talking about. Astonishing.
And I remember reading, if you look at the absolute peak, the billionaires, it's even more extreme.
It gets even more pronounced, yes.
Yeah.
That same report, it showed a jaw-dropping 88.4% of India's billionaire wealth is concentrated with upper castes.
88%, wow.
Now, put that against the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. These are the officially recognized marginalized groups. Together, they make up nearly 30% of the population. Almost a third.
Okay.
But they own less than 6% of the national wealth.
So 30% of the people, less than 6% of the wealth, compared to maybe 22% with 55%.
Exactly.
It really puts the analogy you mentioned earlier in perspective. The 100-meter race, where one group starts way ahead, like at the 80-meter mark.
And then claims victory based purely on merit.
Yeah. So how did it get this way? Is this just random?
Oh, definitely not accidental. It's deeply, deeply baked into the system. It's historical legacy playing out today.
Can you give an example?
Sure, let's connect it to something really fundamental like land ownership. In Uttar Pradesh, a major state, upper caste Hindus are about 15% of households.
15%?
But they control nearly 30% of the cultivable land. Double their population share.
And this goes way back.
Way back. This pattern was even formalized during the colonial era. You had laws like the Land Alienation Act, which basically stopped land transferring from landowning castes to others.
So it locked in the inequality.
It institutionalized those patterns. And unfortunately, those patterns persist, and they continue to shape economic power today.
So, okay, we see this massive wealth concentration. What are the actual, day-to-day economic consequences for India as a whole? Why is this an economic problem, not just a social justice issue?
Well, the implications are profound. I mean, first off, such skewed ownership, it just starves broad-based demand.
Because most people don't have much money to spend.
Exactly. When the vast majority has limited wealth, limited purchasing power, you simply can't build a truly robust, consumption-driven economy. It puts a ceiling on growth.
Makes sense.
But it's more than just consumption. It also means capital isn't flowing where it's necessarily needed most.
How so?
It gets hoarded, concentrated, it's deployed inefficiently. It doesn't easily flow to new ideas, diverse sectors, or maybe entrepreneurs from different backgrounds.
Right, so it stifles innovation.
It prevents that kind of entrepreneurial dynamism, yeah.
Yeah.
The broad innovation that really drives dynamic economic growth in the long run.
So wealth concentration is one massive piece. But you said earlier, that's only half the story.
It is. Because the real tragedy, and I'd argue the even more profound economic cost, it lies in the systematic exclusion of human potential.
Wasted talent.
That's precisely the human cost we're talking about. Think about education, historically. Quality education was, for a very long time, almost exclusively the domain of upper castes.
Right.
At the turn of the 20th century, literacy was pretty much the norm for, say, Brahmin men.
Okay.
But it was virtually non-existent among Dalits. That initial advantage, it just compounds over generations.
Creating these persistent gaps.
Exactly. Persistent educational disparities that have massive economic repercussions down the line.
And is that still visible today? I mean, surely things have improved.
Things have improved, but the data is still pretty stark. Look at school choice. 48% of general caste households opt for private schools.
Okay, nearly half.
Compare that to just 33% who choose public ones. That suggests a clear perception of a quality gap.
Yeah, people voting with their feet or wallets.
And it often means lower caste students face discrimination. They end up in under-resourced schools, and that leads directly to higher dropout rates.
I think I saw a figure on that.
There was a UNICEF report,
Yeah.
It found the primary school dropout rate for Dalit children was a staggering 44%.
44%, that's almost half. It's not just a statistic, is it? That's potential just vanishing.
Its future's lost. And think about how quickly those early disadvantages compound. Lower skills, fewer opportunities later on.
And that feeds directly into the next stage, right? Like entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. Entrepreneurship is supposed to be a key engine for any economy. Talent and good ideas should attract capital. That's the ideal. But in India, capital often flows along caste lines. It's about networks.
Ah, the who you know factor.
Very much so. Upper caste networks tend to dominate access to credit, to mentorship, to market opportunities. It's hard to break in.
Has anyone tried to quantify that impact?
Yes, economist Sampreet Singh Goraya did some fascinating research. He found that discrimination just in entrepreneurship alone, it reduces India's aggregate total factor productivity.
Which is basically a measure of efficiency, right? How well a country uses its resources.
Exactly. It reduces that by 2.5% and shaves a whole 6% off the GDP. Just from that bottleneck.
6%, again, that number keeps coming up. It's huge.
It's consistent with the broader estimates. And you see it in business ownership, too.
Oh, so?
Historically disadvantaged castes, they're just less likely to even start a business.
Yeah.
Buyer entry costs, financial constraints.
Makes sense.
Look at the numbers. Scheduled castes make up over 19% of the workforce.
Okay, almost a fifth.
But they own just 11.4% of enterprises.
Big gap.
And for scheduled tribes, it's about 10% of the workforce, but only 5.4% of enterprises.
Wow. And even if they do manage to start and run a business?
Even then, the struggle continues. One study found Dalit business owners face a 16% income gap compared to other owners.
16% less income for running a similar business.
Yeah, and here's the really telling part. That gap actually widens at higher levels of social capital.
Wait, it gets worse if they have better networks. That seems counterintuitive.
It suggests that institutional stigma, the bias in the system, prevents them from fully benefiting even from their own connections and efforts. It's deeply ingrained.
And this plays out even in the modern sectors, like the tech startup scene.
Oh, absolutely. India's much lauded startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's even been called an unsaid caste system. Yeah. Venture capital, for instance, overwhelmingly favors graduates from the elite institutions, the IITs and IMs.
Which have historically been
Historically dominated by the upper castes. So the funding follows those established networks.
So obstacles in education, obstacles in entrepreneurship. What about just getting a regular job in the labor market?
The challenges persist there too. There was a really telling field experiment done.
What did they do?
They sent out thousands of identical resumes. The only difference was the names, changed to reflect different castes.
Okay, so same qualifications, just different names suggesting caste background.
Exactly. And the result, resumes with upper caste names were almost twice as likely to get an interview call compared to those with Dalit names.
Twice as likely, just based on a name.
Yeah.
The implication there is just unavoidable, isn't it? This isn't about competence.
Not at all. It's about entrenched prejudice.
Yeah.
And the result is this massive misallocation of talent.
Capable people are just locked out.
Locked out. While conversely, caste loyalties can often trump merit in hiring and promotions.
Yeah.
This happens in government. It happens in the private sector.
And the economy as a whole loses out.
It loses its most valuable asset, human capital. Wasted potential on a huge scale.
Okay, so if this problem is so pervasive, so deep, and so clearly damaging to India's economic potential, it does raise a big question.
Which is?
Why isn't this a bigger story internationally? Why don't we hear more about this massive 6% drag on the economy?
That's a critical question.
Yeah.
And it brings us to a really important factor, the role of the non-resident Indian diaspora, the NRI community.
Ah, okay. How do they fit in?
Well, think about who historically had the means to emigrate. The resources, the networks, the specific kind of educational access.
Right. Especially maybe to the West after laws changed, like in the U.S. in 65, favoring skilled professionals.
Exactly. Those individuals, the ones who could take advantage of those opportunities, have been disproportionately from upper caste backgrounds.
So the doctors, the engineers, the Silicon Valley CEOs.
They became the global face of Indian success. They were the ones interacting with international communities.
Which creates a skewed picture.
It creates what you could call an elite migration bias. When international audiences, investors, policymakers interact with the Indian diaspora, they're often seeing a heavily filtered sample.
A sample that doesn't really represent the full spectrum of Indian society or its economic realities back home.
Precisely.
And this diaspora then has shaped the global narrative.
Consciously or unconsciously, yes. They've often shaped a narrative that downplays or sometimes outright denies the existence and economic impact of caste.
Is there a term for that?
There is. An academic, Ajanta Subramanian, she coined a very powerful term for it, the anaesthetic of merit.
The anaesthetic of merit.
What does that mean exactly?
It's this idea, this narrative, that success is attributed solely to individual hard work and merit, purely individual effort.
Which sounds good on the surface.
It does. But what it does, insidiously, is it renders the immense historical and ongoing privilege of caste completely invisible.
It numbs you to the structural factors. Exactly. It's an anesthetic. It's a comforting story, particularly for those who have succeeded, right? It justifies their success.
And it implies that those who haven't succeeded simply didn't try hard enough.
Right. It dismisses their struggles as a lack of effort, not a lack of opportunity or systemic barriers they faced.
And that has economic consequences, too, this narrative.
Oh, definitely. If international partners, investors, operate under this anesthetic, they might overlook fundamental structural issues in India. They might misallocate capital, funding ventures that inadvertently reinforce hierarchies.
Or they might fail to see the potential in communities outside that elite circle.
Exactly. Failing to identify true growth opportunities within India's broader population because their view is shaped by this merit-only narrative.
But surely that narrative is cracking. Is there evidence from within the diaspora itself that contradicts it?
There is, and it's growing. That Equality Lab survey back in 2018, it was pretty eye-opening.
What did it find?
It found that 2 out of 3 lower caste individuals in the U.S. reported being treated unfairly at their workplace due to their caste.
2 out of 3 in the U.S.
Yes. And then you had the landmark 2020 lawsuit against Cisco. That was huge.
What happened there?
A lead engineer alleged discrimination by his upper caste supervisors. That case really, as many commentators said, shattered the myth that caste discrimination ends at India's borders.
So it brought it out into the open in a major way.
It did, but the resistance to even discussing the issue remains fierce.
How so?
Well, look at the incident with then Mosi Soundarajan, a prominent Dalit activist. She was invited to speak at Google for Dalit History Month.
Okay.
Reports suggest that dominant caste employees internally labeled her Hindu-phobic and put significant pressure on management to cancel the talk, which they did initially.
Wow, that shows how sensitive and contested this is, even in places like Google.
It's not just about social discomfort. It has real economic implications when critical dialogue and awareness are stifled in these influential global hubs.
So, boiling it down, what's the real economic danger of this global misperception, this blind spot?
The danger is significant, as I see it. International partners, investors, they might be operating with a fundamentally flawed understanding of Indian social dynamics.
Flying blind, essentially.
Flying blind is a good way to put it. They might inadvertently fund ventures that reinforce caste hierarchies. Or, perhaps even more importantly from an economic standpoint, they fail to see the immense untapped potential in marginalized communities.
Because their perception of Indian success is just too narrow.
Exactly. Focused on that filtered sample we talked about. It limits their view of the real Indian economy.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, the scale, the economic drag, the global blind spot. Where do we go from here? What are the solutions?
Well, it's not a problem without potential solutions, but it definitely requires moving beyond just superficial reforms.
You mean like affirmative action policies? India has those, right?
Right.
Reservations.
It does. And let's be clear, Those reservation policies have had some success. They've undeniably helped create a new middle class among marginalized communities, which is important.
But there are limitations.
There are limitations, yes. Often, the benefits get captured by what's called the creamy layer, the relatively better off within those marginalized groups.
Okay.
And representation often remains heavily skewed towards lower-tier jobs. Upper castes still tend to dominate senior positions, bureaucracy, judiciary, media, corporate leadership. So reservations haven't fully leveled the playing field at the top.
So if reservations are only part of the answer, what's the truly critical first step?
Data. Without a doubt, data.
Like,
For decades now, India has not conducted a comprehensive nationwide caste census that's been fully released and utilized for policy.
no proper count.
Effectively, no.
Okay.
As one report put it quite starkly, the country is effectively flying blind, designing policies in the dark while claiming to pursue social justice.
You can't fix a problem you refuse to measure accurately.
Precisely. Without that granular data, you can't understand the precise nature of economic inequality. You can't target interventions effectively. You can't track progress. It's fundamental.
Okay, assuming we get the data, what other key solutions does the research point towards?
Well, research suggests several key pathways. First, you absolutely have to address those financial and entrepreneurial bottlenecks we discussed.
Access to capital.
Exactly. Policies that ensure genuinely equitable access to credit and capital. Policies that actively work to break the monopoly of those entrenched caste-based networks.
Like what, specifically?
Well, for instance, think about procurement policies. Multinational firms operating in India could be incentivized or even required to reward contractors who provide verifiable equal opportunities or who actively support marginalized entrepreneurs in their supply chains.
Using market mechanisms to drive change. Okay, what else?
Second, there's a critical need for what you might call strategic enhancement of social capital.
Beyond just money, you mean?
Yes, it's about actively creating platforms, networks, mentorship programs that connect entrepreneurs from marginalized communities with mentors, with markets, with capital.
Why is that specific focus needed?
It's needed specifically to counteract that institutional stigma we talked about, the kind that makes even their existing social capital less effective than it should be. You have to build bridges intentionally.
Right, counteracting the bias. What's the third area?
The third, and this is perhaps the most challenging, it's combating that meritocracy myth, the anaesthetic of merit.
The cultural battle.
It really is a cultural battle. It requires actively acknowledging, talking about, and challenging this narrative.
Moving away from just pretending caste doesn't exist.
Exactly. Shifting from a supposedly colorblind or caste-blind approach, which often just ignores the problem, to one that explicitly recognizes and addresses systemic bias and inherited privilege within economic systems.
Acknowledging the starting lines in that race are different.
Precisely. And finally, there's the international dimension.
Bringing it back to the global stage.
Yes. Supporting the internationalization of caste as a human rights issue is important. Advocating for domestic legislation against caste discrimination in diaspora countries that can create crucial external pressure.
And provide legal avenues for redress for people facing discrimination outside India.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It helps bring this hidden economic burden out into the open globally.
So, wrapping this up, the story of India's growth, it's undeniably powerful. We started there.
We did.
But the evidence we've looked at today, it really seems overwhelming. The caste system, the dominance that perpetuates it, it's functioning like a massive self-imposed economic handicap.
It truly is. On one of the world's most dynamic nations, it's a system that, as we've seen, misallocates capital, wastes incredible amounts of talent, suppresses innovation.
And ultimately undermines the very foundations of a modern competitive economy.
Absolutely. The cost isn't just measured in social injustice, which is profound enough. It's measurable in potentially trillions of dollars of lost growth for India and missed opportunities for its global partners, too.
So what's the core takeaway for you, for our listeners?
For me, it's that dismantling these barriers, it isn't about tearing anyone down. That's not the point.
Right.
It's about lifting everyone up, unlocking the full human and economic potential of over 1 billion people. That's not just India's greatest challenge. It is arguably its single greatest opportunity.
An opportunity for truly inclusive and maybe even exponential growth.
That's the potential, yes. Which means this is a conversation that just needs to be had. Openly, honestly.
Not just in India.
Not just in the villages and cities of India, but in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, in the halls of global financial institutions, wherever India's future is being discussed.
Because ultimately, India's rise to its absolute full potential. It really depends on the talents of all its people, doesn't it? Not just a privileged few.
That's the bottom line.
And understanding this systemic issue, this hidden handbrake, is just crucial for anyone truly interested in global economics, in social justice, and in the real trajectory of India in the 21st century.